This is not breaking news. This is not a scandal. This is not about one person. This is about something quieter, something procedural, something that doesn't look dangerous until it's already done its work. Right now, power is not fighting disclosure. It's delaying it. It's fragmenting it. It's burying it under process, jurisdiction, and time. And that matters because history doesn't collapse all at once. It erodes slowly, legally, with paperwork. What you are watching is not outrage. It's a test of whether truth still has a deadline or whether delay itself has become a shield. If this holds, it won't just decide what gets released. It will decide whether release is ever required at all. So stay with me. Not because this is dramatic, but because once this mechanism works, it doesn't stop here. And the next step is already in motion. What actually controls this system right now is not outrage. It's not elections. It's not even loyalty. It's process. Process decides what moves. Process decides what waits. Process decides what gets reviewed, redacted, reconsidered, and quietly rescheduled. When accountability becomes procedural, power doesn't need to deny anything. It just needs to manage the calendar. Deadlines turn into discussions. Requests turn into negotiations. Legal obligations turn into ongoing reviews. And notice how clean that sounds, how reasonable, how neutral. This is how responsibility dissolves without ever being rejected. No dramatic refusal, no visible obstruction, just compliance that never quite completes. That's why personalities don't actually matter here. They're interchangeable. What matters is the architecture they're standing inside. Because once a system learns it can survive by slowing truth down, it stops fearing exposure. It starts relying on exhaustion. And that's where the shift begins. Not loudly, but permanently. Because what changed next was so gradual, most people didn't notice it happening. There was a time when delay looked like failure, when missed deadlines raised alarms, when silence created pressure. That time passed quietly. What replaced it was normalization. Normalization of extensions, normalization of redactions, normalization of explanations that never quite explained anything before disclosure was the event. Now, disclosure is a process, and processes don't end. They loop. Before, the question was what happened? Now, the question is who decides when you're allowed to know? That shift matters because slow change doesn't feel like loss. It feels like patience. It feels like due diligence. It feels responsible. But over time, responsibility moves away from truth and toward management. Management of expectations, management of attention, management of fatigue. And here's the danger. Once people adapt to waiting, waiting stops feeling like a problem. It becomes the system, which means when something finally breaks through, when a moment forces action, it doesn't arrive as clarity. It arrives as shock. And the first real shock has already happened. Then the system slipped just enough to show itself, not through a leak, not through a confession, but through a court order. A federal judge asked a simple question, not what is being withheld, but who gets to decide whether withholding is allowed. That question matters because it wasn't rhetorical. It came with a deadline, and it came with authority. For the first time, delay was no longer just administrative. It was judicially visible. At the same moment, outside the system, pressure surfaced in a different form. Public, uncontrolled, unfiltered. You saw anger collide with power in real time, not as a policy debate, as friction. And notice what didn't happen next. There was no clarification, no sudden transparency, no reset. Instead, the system did what it always does under stress. It reframed, it redirected, it bought time. This is where I want you to pause for a second, because moments like this don't arrive often. If you want to understand how power responds when it's cornered, this is the moment to keep watching. Because what followed wasn't resistance. It was adaptation. This is the mechanism. When pressure rises, the system doesn't close ranks. It diffuses. Responsibility gets spread across offices, committees, departments. No single hand on the wheel. No single point of failure. Documents exist, but in volume. Deadlines exist, but with conditions. Compliance exists, but with exceptions. So when someone asks, why isn't this finished? The answer is always technically correct. There are millions of pages. There are legal obligations. There are privacy concerns. There are ongoing reviews, each one reasonable, together, paralyzing. And here's the crucial part. The cost of delay is never paid by the people who control it. They absorb time. They absorb scrutiny. They absorb patience. The damage gets outsourced to public trust, to survivors waiting for answers, to a system that quietly teaches itself that it can outlast accountability. That's why delay isn't a flaw here. It's a feature, and once you see that, the next escalation makes sense. Because the system didn't just slow things down, it changed the subject. Watch how fast it happens. The focus shifts. The names change. The center moves. Questions about process turn into arguments about people. Demands for disclosure turn into debates over motive. Delay turns into noise. One hearing, another statement, another clip, another accusation. The system accelerates sideways, not forward, not toward answers, but outward attention fragments. Outrage competes with outrage. Every new angle feels urgent. None of them resolve anything. This is escalation without progress, motion without direction, and it works because speed feels like action. Volume feels like momentum. Conflict feels like accountability. But underneath it, nothing actually moves. Documents remain unreleased. Decisions remain pending. Deadlines remain flexible. This is the moment most people disengage. Not because they stop caring, because they can't tell where to look anymore. And once that happens, the system doesn't need to hide. It just waits. This is where it reaches you. Not as a headline, not as a clip, but as a pattern you've already learned to live with. You watch institutions promise answers, then explain why answers take time. You hear transparency described as a future event, always coming, never arriving, so you adjust. You lower expectations, you stop marking dates on the calendar. And that adjustment has a cost, because every time delay is normalized, the burden shifts away from power and onto the public. You are asked to be patient, to be reasonable, to trust the process, but trust without outcomes isn't trust. It's compliance. And here's the quiet danger. When people stop expecting resolution, systems stop providing it. That's how accountability fades, without a single rule being broken. So if this feels familiar, that's not an accident. It's training. And the reason it matters now is because this mechanism doesn't stay contained. Once this mechanism proves it works, it travels. Not geographically at first, institutionally. Other agencies notice, other governments watch, other systems learn, because delay is contagious. When one powerful institution survives by slowing truth down, it teaches others that disclosure is optional, as long as it's perpetually in progress. You see it in cross-border investigations that never quite conclude, in international requests that get acknowledged, then parked, in cooperation that exists on paper, but dissolves in practice. And suddenly, this isn't local anymore. It's procedural culture. Truth becomes jurisdictional. Accountability becomes negotiable. Transparency becomes conditional. That's when the danger shifts scale. Because once multiple systems adopt the same defense, volume, complexity, time. There's nowhere left to appeal. No higher authority, no faster lane. Just overlapping processes, each waiting on the other. And when that happens, delay stops being a tactic. It becomes the environment, which leaves only one unanswered question. What happens next? When a system built on waiting is forced to move, from here, there are only three paths. None of them are clean. The first is adjustment. The system bends just enough to relieve pressure. A monitor, a review, a controlled release. Not everything, just enough to prove responsiveness. Order is preserved, authority remains intact. The mechanism survives with minor damage. The second path is erosion. Delay continues. Deadlines slide, attention thins out. Nothing dramatic fails. It just weakens. Confidence drains slowly. Institutions keep functioning, but fewer people believe in them. Truth exists, but only in fragments, and fragments don't mobilize. Then there's the third path. Rupture. Something breaks the timing. A ruling, a leak, a conflict the system can't pace. Suddenly, speed replaces control. Information outruns management. Process can't keep up. And when that happens, the question is no longer what should be released. It's what can't be contained anymore. Which path we're on isn't visible yet. But the system knows it's running out of room. There's a temptation at the end of stories like this to look for reassurance, for closure, for someone to step in and fix it. That's not how this works. Systems don't collapse because people stop believing in them. They collapse because they learn they don't have to answer anymore. What you're watching now is not a verdict. It's a precedent forming in real time. If delay succeeds here, it becomes the model. If redaction outlasts scrutiny, it becomes the standard. And the most dangerous part is that none of this requires a cover-up. Only patience, only complexity, only time. So the question isn't whether the truth exists. It's whether the system is still structured to ever let it arrive. Because once accountability becomes optional, it doesn't announce itself. It just quietly stops showing up. If you want to understand where this goes next, you don't watch for explosions. You watch for silence. And you decide, before the waiting becomes permanent, whether silence is an acceptable answer. Stay with this story. Because the next phase won't look dramatic. It will look procedural. And by then, it may already be too late.